The Crystal Palace's grand ballroom sparkled with the kind of artificial magnificence that politicians loved and soldiers instinctively mistrusted. Commander Alex Hartwell, former commander, Alex reminded themselves with the kind of bitter precision that came from too many years of military habit, stood near a pillar that offered excellent tactical positioning and terrible conversation opportunities. The 10th anniversary celebration of the Treaty of Synergia was in full swing, which meant hundreds of diplomats, trade representatives, and assorted galactic dignitaries were consuming expensive alcohol and making speeches about peace, prosperity, and the bright future of interspecies cooperation. Alex had been invited as one of the war heroes who made peace possible, a designation that sounded much more impressive than it felt. The reality was Messier. A career soldier who'd spent 3 decades learning how to kill efficiently, followed by 10 years trying to figure out what to do when the killing stopped being necessary. Commander Hartwell, a young human diplomat, approached with the kind of eager smile that suggested he'd been assigned to manage the difficult veterans. "I'm Ambassador Walsh from the Terran Colonial Office. I wanted to thank you personally for your service during the border wars." "Just Alex now. I'm retired." "Of course, sir. Still, your actions at Kepler Ridge were instrumental in bringing about the peace we celebrate tonight." Alex accepted a drink from a passing server and tried not to wince at the mention of Kepler Ridge. That battle had become legend, retold in simplified versions that bore little resemblance to the desperate, chaotic reality Alex remembered. According to official history, it was a brilliant example of tactical cooperation between former enemies. According to Alex's nightmares, it was a day when everything went wrong and somehow ended up going right. The official reports probably make it sound more heroic than it actually was, Alex said diplomatically. Heroic, strategic, and inspiring, Walsh agreed enthusiastically. The first successful joint operation between human and Zephyrian forces. A turning point that proved cooperation was possible. Before Alex could explain that cooperation was a generous term for what had actually happened, the ambassador's attention was captured by someone more politically important, and he drifted away with practiced grace. Alex retreated further into the shadows, watching the celebration with the detached observation skills that military training never quite let you abandon. The guest list read like a directory of galactic power. Centauri trade ministers discussing shipping routes, Proximan cultural attaches debating artistic exchange programs, and scattered throughout, the elegant figures of Zephyrian diplomats whose pointed ears and graceful movements marked them as members of the species that had been humanity's most formidable enemy for the better part of 2 decades. The irony wasn't lost on Alex. 10 years ago, seeing this many Zephyrians in one room would have meant a battle was about to start. Tonight, it meant the peace was holding. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings from across the galaxy, the evening's master of ceremonies began, his voice carrying easily across the vast ballroom. "We gather tonight to celebrate not just a treaty, but a transformation. 10 years ago, our worlds were divided by fear, mistrust, and the terrible arithmetic of warfare. Tonight, we stand together as allies, partners, and friends." Alex tuned out the speech, having heard variations of it at every diplomatic function for the past decade. The words were true enough, the peace had held, trade was flourishing, and the younger generation was growing up in a galaxy where interspecies cooperation was normal rather than revolutionary. But speeches never captured the personal cost of the transformation they celebrated. The applause that followed the opening remarks provided cover for Alex to move toward the refreshment area, hoping to find something stronger than the diplomatic wine that tasted like it had been designed by committee to offend no one and please nobody. That was when the voice cut through the polite noise of celebration like a blade through silk. "Do you recall me, human?" Alex froze, the glass halfway to their lips. The voice carried the musical cadence that marked it as Zephyrian, but underneath the formal diplomatic tone was something else, an edge of steel that spoke of battlefields and hard choices. Slowly, Alex turned toward the source of the voice and felt the years collapse like a house of cards. Princess Liana of the Zephyrian High Command stood 3 feet away, resplendent in formal diplomatic attire that couldn't quite conceal the bearing of someone who'd spent years in combat zones. Her ears swept upward in the elegant points that marked her species, but it was her eyes that stopped Alex's breath, the same eyes that had looked across a smoky battlefield 10 years ago and made a choice that changed the course of galactic history. She was older now, carrying the kind of weathered dignity that came from surviving both war and peace. Scars traced delicate patterns along her left temple, and her hands showed the calluses of someone who still knew how to handle weapons despite her current diplomatic posting. "I rescued the alien princess's life in combat many years ago," she continued, her formal words carrying undertones that only Alex would understand. The statement was technically accurate according to official records, but Alex remembered it differently. They had saved each other, in ways that went far beyond simple battlefield tactics. The celebration continued around them, but Alex felt as if the entire galaxy had suddenly become very small and very quiet. "Princess Lyanna," Alex said carefully, falling back on the diplomatic protocols that had been drilled into every veteran who might encounter former enemy officers at social functions. "Of course I remember. Do you? Sometimes I wonder if the official histories have replaced the actual memories. They have made us both more heroic and less human than we actually were." Alex glanced around the ballroom, noting the curious glances from nearby diplomats who were probably wondering why a retired human commander and a Zephyrian princess were having what looked like an intense conversation at a peace celebration. "The official histories have their purpose," Alex said diplomatically. "Yes, but I did not approach you to discuss official purposes." Lyanna moved closer, lowering her voice so their conversation wouldn't be overheard by the growing number of interested observers. "I approached you because 10 years ago, you made a choice that saved my life, ended a war, and changed the destiny of 2 civilizations. And because I have wondered, every day since, whether you remember it the way I do." Alex met her gaze directly, seeing past the diplomatic polish to the warrior who had faced impossible odds with stubborn determination and unexpected honor. "I remember everything, Princess. Including the parts they didn't put in the official reports. Including the moment when you stopped seeing me as an enemy. Including the moment when we both realized we were fighting the wrong war." For the first time since she'd approached, Lyanna smiled. Not the practiced diplomatic expression she wore for cameras and formal functions, but the genuine smile Alex remembered from that impossible day when trust became more important than tactics. "Then perhaps," she said, "we should find somewhere more private to discuss the parts of history that belong only to us." The balcony overlooked Haven's famous crystalline gardens, where bioluminescent plants from a dozen worlds created patterns of light that shifted with the moon's gentle breeze. Alex and Lyanna stood at the rail, each holding a glass of something that tasted considerably better than the diplomatic wine served inside, watching the alien flowers pulse in rhythms that seemed almost musical. "I've always wondered," Lyanna said, breaking the comfortable silence, "whether you knew I was royalty when you made the decision to trust me." Alex considered this while watching a cluster of Terran roses interact with Centauri light moss in ways that would have been impossible before the peace treaty. "I knew you outranked everyone else in your unit. The way your soldiers looked at you, the way they followed orders even when those orders made no tactical sense. Like cooperating with the humans who had been shooting at us for 6 hours. Especially that." Alex turned to study Lyanna's profile, noting how the garden's bioluminescence reflected off the scars along her temple. "But honestly, I didn't care about your rank. I cared about the fact that you were the only Zephyrian commander who'd ever tried to minimize casualties instead of maximize them. Is that why you agreed to the joint retreat?" "I agreed to the joint retreat because we were all going to die if we didn't work together, and you were the first enemy officer I'd met who seemed more interested in keeping her people alive than proving a point." Lyanna laughed, a sound that held echoes of the bitter amusement they'd both developed during the war. "The Battle of Kepler Ridge. Do you know what the official Zephyrian history calls it?" "I'm afraid to ask." "A masterpiece of strategic cooperation between allied forces. They don't mention that we spent the first half of the day trying to kill each other. The human version calls it the first joint operation of the Synergia campaign," Alex replied. "They somehow forgot to mention that your strike force had been hunting my unit for 3 weeks and had us completely surrounded when the Dominion forces showed up." "Ah yes, the Dominion. The third party that nobody wanted to deal with." Lyanna sipped her drink thoughtfully. Amazing how being attacked by mutual enemies can clarify your priorities. Alex remembered that moment with crystalline clarity, the canyon walls echoing with weapons fire, their small human unit pinned down by Dominion heavy weapons while Lyanna's Zephyrian forces found themselves caught between two enemies they hadn't expected to encounter. The tactical situation had been a textbook example of how not to conduct military operations. You know what I remember most clearly? Alex said. The look on your communications officer's face when you ordered him to open a channel to our unit. Sergeant Velik. He thought I had suffered a concussion and was hallucinating. Lyanna's expression grew thoughtful. He wasn't entirely wrong. The whole situation was so impossible that rational military doctrine had stopped applying. What was going through your head when you made that call? Desperation, mostly. And the realization that if my forces and your forces destroyed each other, the Dominion would control the entire Kepler system by nightfall. She paused, seeming to organize memories that had been classified for years. Also, I was tired of fighting a war that seemed designed to kill everyone except the people who started it. Alex nodded, understanding completely. I remember thinking that if we were all going to die anyway, we might as well die fighting the right enemy. And when I proposed a joint retreat through the North Canyon, I thought you were either brilliant or insane. Possibly both. What convinced you to trust the proposal? Alex was quiet for a moment, watching the light patterns in the garden shift from blue to green to something that didn't have a name in human languages. You used the phrase, our combined forces instead of, your forces and my forces. It was a small thing, but it suggested you were thinking like an ally instead of an enemy making a temporary bargain. I was thinking like someone who had just realized that the person I'd been trying to kill for 3 weeks was actually trying to accomplish the same strategic objectives I was, just from the other direction. The joint retreat had been chaos managed by necessity and coordinated through hand signals, shared ammunition, and a kind of desperate improvisation that military academies would never teach. Alex's unit provided covering fire while Lyanna's forces cleared the canyon approaches, then the Zephyrians returned the favor while the humans dealt with the Dominion's aerial support. By the time they reached defensive positions on the canyon's far side, both units were fighting as a single combined force. My favorite part of the official reports, Alex said, is how they describe our seamless tactical integration. Seamless, Lyanna repeated with amusement. I recall at least 15 minutes where nobody knew who was supposed to be giving orders to whom. And that argument between your weapons specialist and my demolitions expert about the proper way to set charges on Dominion armor. Which ended with them working together to create explosives that were twice as effective as anything either of our militaries had developed independently. That should have been our first clue about what cooperation could accomplish. They fell into comfortable silence, both lost in memories of a day that had started as another skirmish in an endless war and ended as the foundation for galactic peace. The official histories made it sound inevitable, but Alex remembered the uncertainty, the constant risk that old reflexes would override new alliances, the way trust had to be built one decision at a time under enemy fire. Alex, Lyanna said suddenly, using their first name for the first time that evening, there's something I never told you about that day. What? When we reached the evacuation point and my transport arrived to extract my forces, I was given direct orders to leave your unit behind. Alex turned to stare at her. What? High Command's position was that the cooperation had served its purpose and that human forces were still technically enemy combatants. I was ordered to withdraw immediately and leave you to handle the Dominion pursuit alone. But you didn't. I told High Command that the tactical situation required continued cooperation to ensure successful extraction of all Allied personnel. Lyanna's smile held an edge that belonged to her warrior days. I may have implied that the human forces had information vital to Zephyrian security interests. Did we? You had me. And I had decided that I was more interested in keeping my new allies alive than in following orders from people who hadn't been there when we needed them. Alex processed this information, understanding for the first time the personal risk Lyanna had taken. Your career could have ended that day. It nearly did. I spent 6 months under investigation for unauthorized collaboration with enemy forces before the political winds shifted and suddenly I was a visionary architect of interspecies cooperation. And now you're a princess. Now I'm a diplomat whose primary qualification is that I once trusted a human commander when trust was supposed to be impossible. They stood together in the garden's shifting light, two veterans sharing the kind of comfortable understanding that came from having survived impossible situations together. Around them, the crystalline plants pulsed in patterns that seemed to respond to their presence, creating a light show that was probably worth more than Alex's entire military pension. Lyanna, Alex said finally, do you ever regret it? The choice to trust instead of fight? Only on days when I have to attend diplomatic functions where people make speeches about how inevitable the peace was. She turned to face Alex directly. What about you? Do you regret agreeing to work with the alien commander who had been hunting you for 3 weeks? Only when I have to listen to politicians explain how my tactical decisions were part of some grand strategy one was apparently too stupid to understand at the time. We should write our own history of that battle someday. What would we call it? How two enemies accidentally invented peace while trying not to die. Alex laughed, the sound carrying across the gardens and mixing with the night sounds of a dozen alien species that had learned to coexist in impossible beauty. That's the best title I've heard all evening. Their moment of shared remembrance was shattered by the sound of formal footsteps approaching across the balcony's polished stone. Both Alex and Lyanna turned, their military instincts automatically cataloging the newcomer, tall, imposing, with the kind of rigid posture that suggested either high rank or deeply held convictions. His Zephyrian features were more sharply defined than Lyanna's, his pointed ears decorated with the intricate metalwork that indicated noble birth and political significance. Princess Lyanna, the newcomer said, his voice carrying the kind of cold formality that made diplomatic receptions feel like battlefields, I have been searching for you. Ambassador Thorek, Lyanna replied, and Alex caught the subtle shift in her tone, from relaxed familiarity to guarded professionalism. I was not aware that you required my immediate attention. I require explanations. Thorek's gaze shifted to Alex with the kind of analytical intensity that suggested he'd already identified them, researched their background, and reached unfavorable conclusions. Specifically, explanations for why our most senior diplomatic representative is conducting private conversations with humans whose loyalty during the war remains questionable. Alex felt their military training kick in, the same calm alertness that had kept them alive through 3 decades of combat zones. Ambassador Thorek, I believe. I'm Alex Hartwell, retired commander, Terran Colonial Defense Force. I am aware of who you are, Commander Hartwell. I am also aware of your role in the incident at Kepler Ridge. The incident that ended the war and established the foundation for the peace we're celebrating tonight. Alex kept their voice level, but something in Thorek's tone suggested this conversation was heading somewhere unpleasant. The incident that demonstrated how easily Zephyrian military discipline can be compromised by human manipulation tactics. Excuse me. Alex and Lyanna spoke simultaneously, their voices carrying the kind of synchronized outrage that suggested they'd had plenty of practice backing each other up. Thorek produced a data tablet with the theatrical precision of someone who'd been planning this confrontation. I have here the classified tactical recordings from the Battle of Kepler Ridge. Transmissions that were sealed for 10 years but have recently been declassified for historical review. Lyanna's expression went very still. Thorek, what are you doing? I am demonstrating why the current peace treaty represents a fundamental betrayal of Zephyrian principles. He activated the tablet, and suddenly the balcony filled with the sounds of 10-year-old battlefield communications, weapon fire, shouted orders, and the crackling interference of emergency frequencies. Alex recognized their own voice, younger and more desperate. Zephyrian Commander, this is Colonel Hartwell. We have mutual problems that require mutual solutions. Then Lyanna's response, equally desperate but trying to project authority, Colonel Hartwell, I am prepared to discuss temporary tactical cooperation. Temporary, Thorek repeated with satisfaction. Note how quickly temporary became permanent alliance. Note how easily our military commander accepted human strategic input. I accepted strategic input that kept both our forces alive, Lioness said coldly. Unless you believe death in the name of ideological purity would have better served the Zephyrian Empire. I believe that compromising with enemies reveals weakness that invites exploitation. Thorek advanced the recording to a later section. Here, Princess, where you explicitly state that you trust the human commander's tactical assessment over your own military judgment. Alex remembered that moment. The discussion about whether to attempt the canyon retreat or try to hold their current position until reinforcements arrived. Lyanna had deferred to Alex's knowledge of the terrain, a decision that had saved both their forces but had apparently been interpreted as military insubordination by some factions. Ambassador Thorek, Alex said, moving slightly closer to Lyanna in a gesture that was probably more protective than diplomatic protocol recommended, are you seriously suggesting that Princess Lyanna should have chosen military failure over successful cooperation? I am suggesting that military success achieved through collaboration with enemies is indistinguishable from defeat. Tell that to the soldiers who survived because we worked together. Tell that to the Zephyrian traditions that were abandoned because our leaders chose sentiment over strength. Lyanna stepped forward, and Alex recognized the expression she wore. The same look she'd had just before making the command decision that changed galactic history. Thorek, I am going to explain something to you very clearly. 10 years ago, I was faced with a choice: maintain ideological purity while my soldiers died in a meaningless engagement, or trust someone who had demonstrated honor under impossible circumstances. I chose honor. I chose life. I chose the possibility that our species could be something better than eternal enemies. You chose to be manipulated by human psychological tactics. I chose to recognize that the human commander who had been hunting my forces for 3 weeks could have abandoned us to the Dominion and chose not to. I chose to believe that someone who shared ammunition with former enemies and risked their own life to evacuate wounded Zephyrian soldiers might actually be worth trusting. Alex watched this exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't really about the Battle of Kepler Ridge. This was about competing visions of what the peace meant and whether it represented strength or weakness. Princess, Alex said carefully, perhaps I should return to the celebration and let you handle this internal discussion. No, Lyanna said firmly. This concerns you as much as it concerns me. Ambassador Thorek believes that our cooperation was a mistake that has weakened both our species. I believe it was the beginning of something that has made us stronger than we ever were as enemies. The princess speaks of strength, Thorek said, his tone growing more formal and therefore more dangerous, but the evidence suggests otherwise. 10 years of peace have made our military soft, our borders vulnerable, our young people ignorant of the disciplines that built our civilization. Our young people are learning to build things instead of just destroying them, Alex said. They're developing technologies, art, and ideas that wouldn't exist if we were still trying to kill each other. They are learning dependence on alien allies instead of self-reliance. They're learning that alien and enemy don't have to be synonyms. Thorek's expression suggested he found this concept fundamentally offensive. Commander Hartwell, your species has been expanding aggressively across this galactic sector for centuries. The peace treaty has simply given you access to Zephyrian resources and technology without the inconvenience of conquest. And your species has gained access to human innovation and adaptability without having to admit that maybe some of your traditional approaches weren't working as well as you thought. This, Thorek said, gesturing between Alex and Lyanna, is exactly what I mean. Inappropriate familiarity between former enemies, casual discussion of classified military operations, the assumption that personal relationships can supersede political necessity. Lyanna's voice grew dangerously quiet. Thorek, are you questioning my judgment or my loyalty? I am questioning whether 10 years of peace have made you forget which species you serve. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either violence or very serious diplomatic incidents. Alex felt their combat instincts evaluating exits, weapons, and the probability that this balcony conversation was about to become a much larger problem. Ambassador Thorek, Alex said with the kind of calm that came from years of de-escalating dangerous situations, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding here. Enlighten me. You seem to think that Princess Lyanna's cooperation with human forces represents some kind of weakness or betrayal. But from where I stand, it represents exactly the kind of strength that makes someone worth following into impossible situations. And why should your opinion of Zephyrian's strength matter to me? Because I'm the human who spent 3 weeks trying to kill her before I realized she was the most honorable enemy I'd ever fought. And because if you think cooperation with former enemies is weakness, you fundamentally misunderstood what it takes to end a war instead of just winning battles. Thorek studied Alex with the kind of cold assessment that suggested he was recalculating his approach. An interesting perspective, Commander. Perhaps we should return to the celebration and discuss these philosophical differences in a more appropriate forum. It was clearly a dismissal, but Alex had spent too many years in military service to be intimidated by diplomatic maneuvering. Actually, Ambassador, I think this is exactly the right forum. Because if you're going to question the decisions that ended the war, you should probably talk to the people who actually made those decisions. And if I'm going to defend them, Lyanna added, I want witnesses who understand what was actually at stake. Thorek's smile was sharp enough to cut crystal. Then perhaps, Princess, we should make this conversation more official. What started as a private conversation on a diplomatic balcony had somehow evolved into an impromptu tribunal in the Crystal Palace's formal debate chamber, with representatives from a dozen worlds serving as unwilling witnesses to what was rapidly becoming the most significant political confrontation of the peace celebration. Ambassador Thorek had invoked formal procedures that Alex didn't understand but that clearly carried serious implications for both Lyanna's career and the stability of the peace treaty itself. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings, Thorek addressed the hastily assembled crowd with the confidence of someone who had been planning this moment for years. We gather to address a fundamental question about the nature of our interspecies alliance. Specifically, whether personal relationships between former enemy commanders represent strength or compromise the integrity of our respective governments. Alex sat in what had been designated as the human perspective section, feeling completely out of their depth in a political arena where diplomatic protocols carried more weight than combat experience. Lyanna occupied the formal position reserved for accused parties, her diplomatic composure intact despite the fact that her entire career was apparently under review. Ambassador Thorek, the Terran colonial representative, interjected, "This seems like an unusual forum for reviewing historical military decisions." On the contrary, Ambassador Walsh, this is the perfect forum. The Battle of Kepler Ridge has become the foundation myth of human-Zephyrian cooperation. If that foundation is flawed, then everything built upon it becomes questionable. Thorek activated the chamber's main display, showing tactical recordings, official reports, and what appeared to be classified intelligence assessments from the past decade. Alex recognized some of the material but realized that much of what Thorek had assembled would be news even to them. The evidence shows a pattern of behavior that extends far beyond a single battlefield decision, Thorek continued. Princess Lyanna has consistently advocated for human positions in diplomatic negotiations, provided intelligence about Zephyrian military capabilities to human allies, and maintained personal relationships that compromise her ability to represent Zephyrian interests objectively. Or, Lyanna said, rising to address the assembly with the kind of commanding presence that reminded everyone why she'd been effective in both military and diplomatic roles, the evidence shows someone who understands that the old model of thinking in terms of us versus them has become counterproductive in a galaxy where cooperation produces better results than competition. Princess, with respect, your personal feelings toward Commander Hartwell. My personal feelings toward Alex Hartwell, Lyanna interrupted with steel in her voice, are based on 10 years of observing someone who consistently chooses the welfare of others over personal advantage. If that represents a character flaw, then I suggest our definition of leadership needs revision. Alex felt the weight of the assembly's attention as Lyanna continued her defense, realizing that this had become about much more than their individual choices during one battle. Ambassador Thorek wants to know whether personal relationships compromise political judgment. I want to know whether political judgment that ignores personal character is worth preserving. Character, Thorek said dismissively, is a luxury that leaders cannot afford when making decisions that affect entire civilizations. No, Alex said, standing up despite having no formal role in these proceedings. Character is the only thing that makes those decisions worth making. The chamber fell quiet as Alex moved to the center of the room, aware that they were about to either support Lyanna's position or completely destroy it. 10 years ago, Princess Lyanna and I faced a situation where all our training, all our protocols, and all our official guidance pointed toward continued conflict. We were supposed to fight until one side was destroyed, because that's what enemies do. But we looked at each other across the battlefield and realized something that apparently threatens Ambassador Thorek's worldview. And what was that? Asked the Centauri observer. That we were fighting the wrong war. That the real enemy wasn't each other, it was the assumption that our species were fundamentally incompatible. Alex gestured toward the tactical displays that showed the chaos of Kepler Ridge. Princess Lyanna didn't compromise her loyalty to the Zephyrian Empire when she trusted me. She expanded her understanding of what serving the Empire actually meant. Elaborate, Thorek demanded. She realized that an empire that could only survive by destroying its neighbors wasn't worth preserving. Just like I realized that humanity's expansion meant nothing if it was built on the assumption that everyone else in the galaxy was our enemy. Lyanna stood, moving to join Alex at the chamber's center. What Alex is trying to explain, Ambassador Thorek, is that character and political judgment aren't opposing forces. They're the same thing. The decision to trust isn't weakness, it's the foundation of any relationship worth building. And if that trust is misplaced? Thorek pressed. Then you learn from the mistake and trust more carefully next time, Alex replied. But if you never risk trust at all, you guarantee that you'll spend your entire existence surrounded by enemies of your own creation. 10 years, Lyanna said, addressing the assembly directly. 10 years of peace, cooperation, and shared prosperity. Not because we signed treaties or established trade agreements, but because two soldiers chose to believe that former enemies could become allies if they were willing to see each other as people rather than threats. And what happens, Thorek asked, when that personal relationship ends? When Commander Hartwell's feelings toward you change, or when political pressures require choosing between human and Zephyrian interests? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Alex realized that Thorek had identified the fundamental weakness in their defense. Personal relationships could change, could be manipulated, could create conflicts of interest that compromised political judgment. You want to know what happens when the personal relationship changes? Alex asked. I'll tell you. 3 years ago, there was a trade dispute between the Terran colonies and the Zephyrian Empire over mineral rights in the Vega system. Princess Lyanna was the lead Zephyrian negotiator. I was consulted as an expert on Terran mining operations. And she negotiated a deal that was better for the Zephyrian Empire than anything my own government's representatives had proposed. She fought for Zephyrian interests with the same determination she'd shown on the battlefield, and she won concessions that our diplomats said were impossible. Alex turned to face Thorek directly. The relationship didn't make her weak, Ambassador. It made her better at her job, because she understood how to work with humans without being taken advantage of by them. Furthermore, Lyanna added, Alex provided technical assessments that helped identify areas where both sides were making assumptions that hurt everyone involved. The final agreement created more value for both civilizations than either side thought possible. An isolated example, Thorek said, but his tone suggested he was running out of ammunition. No, said Ambassador Walsh, it's part of a pattern. Princess Lyanna's diplomatic successes over the past decade have consistently exceeded expectations precisely because she understands both sides of every negotiation. And Commander Hartwell's consulting work with the Colonial Defense Force, added the Proximan representative, has focused on developing cooperative security protocols that protect everyone's interests instead of just human interests. Alex watched as the political tide in the room shifted, realizing that Thorek's challenge had backfired by forcing other representatives to articulate the benefits of the human-Zephyrian partnership. Ambassador Thorek, Alex said finally, you asked whether personal relationships compromise political judgment. But I think you're asking the wrong question. What should I be asking? Whether political judgment that deliberately ignores personal character produces better results than leadership that integrates both. Alex gestured toward the assembled representatives. Look around this room. How many of these diplomatic relationships would exist if the people involved didn't trust and respect each other personally? The galaxy has become more peaceful, more prosperous, and more innovative, Lyanna added, not because we've eliminated personal relationships from politics, but because we've learned to build political relationships on personal foundations of trust and mutual respect. Thorek was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces of the assembled diplomats. When he spoke again, his voice carried less certainty than it had at the beginning of the evening. And if you are wrong? If this experiment in personal diplomacy eventually fails? Then we'll have learned something valuable about what doesn't work, Alex replied. But if we're right, if trust and cooperation produce better results than suspicion and competition, then we'll have helped build something better than what existed before. The choice, Lyanna said, is between the certainty of repeated conflict and the possibility of lasting peace. I know which one I prefer to bet on. The formal debate ended not with a dramatic conclusion but with the kind of gradual consensus that characterizes most diplomatic breakthroughs. Thorek withdrew his challenges, not because he was convinced but because the political support for his position had evaporated. Later, as the celebration wound down and the representatives began departing for their respective worlds, Alex and Lyanna found themselves back on the balcony where the evening's complications had begun. So, Alex said, do you think we convinced him? I think we convinced the people who matter. Thorek will continue to believe what he believes, but he won't have the political support to make it anyone else's problem. And what happens now? Lyanna turned to face Alex with an expression that mixed professional composure with personal warmth. Now you accept the consulting position with the diplomatic corps that I'm about to offer you. I'm retired. You're experienced. There's a difference. She smiled with the kind of confidence that had made her effective on battlefields and in negotiating chambers. Alex, we've spent 10 years proving that former enemies can become allies. I'd like to spend the next 10 years proving that allies can become something even better. Which is partners. In every sense of the word. Alex looked out at the crystalline gardens where plants from across the galaxy had learned to grow together in impossible beauty, then at the alien princess who had trusted a human soldier when trust seemed impossible. Do you recall me, human? Lyanna had asked at the beginning of the evening. I recall everything, Alex replied. Including the fact that the best decisions I've ever made involved trusting you when logic suggested otherwise. Then you'll take the job. I'll take the job. But only if you promise that it will involve the same kind of impossible problems that made Kepler Ridge interesting. Alex, we're trying to build permanent peace between species that spent centuries trying to destroy each other. I can guarantee you that every day will be exactly that kind of impossible. As they stood together watching the stars emerge over Haven's peaceful skies, Alex realized that some bonds forged in battle were strong enough to build civilizations on. And sometimes, the most important victories happened not when the fighting ended, but when former enemies chose to keep choosing trust, day after day, year after year, until cooperation became stronger than the conflicts that had once divided them.